Hello and welcome to our Fireside Chat. My name is Jessica Chopin-Roney, and I am the new director of the Program in Early American Economy and Society here at the Library Company of Philadelphia, which you can see the original building, for some reason backwards, behind me from the William Birch print. This is today, there's a reconstruction of it that the American Philosophical Society uses. They built it and it's their library, but it's on the copy of what was originally the Library Company. So welcome to our fireside chat with Dr. Michael Blaakman, who's going to talk to us about his magnificent book, Speculation Nation. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and I want to thank Ryan Langton, who is hiding behind the Library Company seal there. He is providing tech support for us tonight. He is a Temple PhD student and a fellow at the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society. So thank you to Ryan. First, I have a couple of announcements, which have just, some of the links have already gone up in the chat. But I'd just like to alert you that Dr. Seth Rockman from Brown University is going to come to Philadelphia on December 11th, and we're going to host an in-person book talk for him. His new book, which is just being released this November, so it will be hot off the presses. This will be the subject of the book talk. The name of the book is Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery, and it promises to be an important and engaging piece of scholarship. So I hope that you'll join us for that. The other announcement, which I'm very excited about, is that PEAS is hosting its first conference in about 5 years. PEAS is currently 25. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary. And so please join us for a conference to celebrate it. It's going to be called PEAS at 25, and it's right here in Philadelphia, February 7th through 8th. And it's going to be called PEAS at 25, Retrospect and Prospect. So we will be celebrating and reflecting on the first 25 years and the leadership of Dr. Kathy Matson. And then we're also going to be pivoting and looking forward to sort of not just what is the state of the field now, but what should it be next? Where are we going in the future? What are the questions and methods and ways of going forward that will guide the next generation of scholarship? And I am delighted to announce we don't have the full program up yet. We don't have everyone's paper titles, but Dr. Blaakman and Dr. Rockman will actually both be participating. So that's exciting. And then my last announcement is think about becoming a Library Company shareholder. Now is a great time to consider becoming a shareholder of the Library Company of Philadelphia. It was founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin and some of his colleagues. And so we are on the cusp of celebrating our 300th anniversary. Each share is numbered. It's a unique share, and it bears the name of its original owner. So I can share, for example, that I have share number 889, which was originally held by Ezra Stiles Eli. And in this time of increased precarity and adversity for so many cultural and historical organizations across the country, and certainly happening in Philadelphia, I urge you to consider supporting the Library Company in its important mission, quote, to pour forth benefits for the common good. That's our Latin motto, which you can see down there in the seal. In the modern era, this mission includes supporting the scholarship of people like Michael Blaakman, who was a fellow at the Library Company, and helping disseminate such scholarship to a wide audience like yourselves. Turning to introducing Michael Blaakman. He is an associate professor of history at Princeton University who received his BA from the College of William and Mary and his PhD from Yale University. The dissertation he wrote there was awarded the 2017 Manuscript Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early Republic, SHEAR. He went on to be a postdoctoral fellow at PEAS, our program at the Library Company, and to teach at the University of St. Thomas before going on to Princeton, which is where he still is. The book to emerge from that prize-winning dissertation is the subject of today's talk, Speculation Nation, Land Mania in the Revolutionary American Republic. The book, published just a year ago in the fall of 2023, has been racking up awards and honors in that short time, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize awarded by the Organization of American Historians for the best first book in American history, He was also, just this past weekend, a finalist for the prestigious George Washington Prize. So, making Michael blush, but I hope you join me in congratulating him on these amazing accomplishments. Finally, in addition to a vigorous scholarly profile in his own right, Michael is a model of collegiality and good citizenship in the profession. As just one example, he organized a wonderful conference sponsored by Pease in 2018 and has since published the proceedings in a co-edited volume called The Early Imperial Republic from the American Revolution to the U.S.-Mexican War. Speaking personally, I've always found him to be a generous and thoughtful interlocutor who helps my own thinking and work immeasurably, not least because he is now very generously serving on the newly created Pease Advisory Board. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to discuss his work. If you have already had the opportunity to dive into Michael's excellent book, you know that it marries wonderful prose with an array of images. Those images are an important part of the interpretation and ability to follow the complex role of land speculation in the era of the American Revolution. Given the importance of those images, Michael and I discussed how to run this event, and we decided that I would share questions with him in advance, allowing him to craft his response in a way that uses some of those images. So you're going to see us kind of back and forth between this model and a model where he is sharing his screen and showing you some of the things that will help walk through the argument and ideas of the book. All right, so jumping into the questions. Hi, Michael, how are you?
Hey, Jess, it's so good to see you. Thanks so much for hosting.
Yay. Thank you so much for coming. We are delighted to get to have this conversation. All right, so here's the first question. You note in your book that no study before yours looked comprehensively at all the land speculating endeavors of the revolutionary period. Usually they look at one part. They might look at a certain area or a certain state or a certain land company, but nobody had ever taken them all on together because it's just crazy complicated. It's so difficult. So my opening question for you is, how did you come to this topic, and how did you come to the idea that you would try and look at them all?
Well, so I should actually, first thing I want to say is thanks so much to the library company for hosting this. This, as a collection and as a community and as a staff, the library company has been so important in my research and the making of this book and in my own development as a scholar. So I'm really thrilled to be here and to be able to kind of offer a bit of a preview into what this book, which is so indebted to the library company, is all about. In response to your question, Jess, I should say, first I should kind of back off that a little bit, because this book definitely does not address all land speculative schemes in the early republic. That would be an insane thing to do, and entirely impossible. But I did try to write something that was national in scope, and that does differentiate this book from the vast majority, I think it's fair to say all of the recent scholarship on land speculation in the early republic, and I tried to make it as comprehensive as I could. That was part of the plan from the beginning. The origins of this book lay in a research paper I wrote in my first year in grad school. It was for a research seminar on frontiers and borderlands, taught by John MacFarrager. And it was going to be like my first big research project as a grad student. And I ended up settling on batch documents that I wanted to turn into a microhistory. And the project was about this 19th century woman named Martha Bradstreet, who spent decades of her life, basically her entire adult life, trying to recover a landed inheritance in central New York that had been kind of pulled out from under her when she was a kid. It had been sold out from under her during this frenzied era of land speculation that followed the American Revolution, this kind of 1780s and 90s period where there's a remarkable enthusiasm for land speculation across the New Republic. I mean, this is like an era when governments are offloading millions of acres of what they claim as public land. It's in truth expropriated native land, or not even expropriated, just sovereign native territory. But governments are trying to unload it by the millions of acres. And when I say governments, I mean everything from Massachusetts and Maine out to Kentucky, from Georgia to the Great Lakes. There's a couple of decades where there's a huge rash of land companies. Speculative schemes are kind of mushrooming in scale. Basically seems like everybody who was a member of the founding elite either was involved in the land business in one way or another, or knew someone, was very close to somebody who was. So, this era was going to be an important kind of background for this early research project I was doing on Martha Bradstreet. And when I was trying to write the project, I started reading everything I could find that touched on this era of land speculation. I learned a ton from this scholarship, but as you kind of hinted, the vast majority of it is written kind of through a local lens or a regional lens, or it's biographical in nature. So I was always kind of left with these unanswered questions. And I figured that there had to be a book out there somewhere that explained on a national level what the early national land business was all about, that, looked at this period of land speculation as a single event. And I got really grumpy with myself that I couldn't find it. It came to a point where I was like, Blaakman, you're a PhD student. What the heck? You can't even find the book that's going to answer your questions. And so I had all these kind of frustrating, grumpy trips to the library stacks until finally it occurred to me, maybe there just wasn't the kind of book I was looking for, and that I should try and think about writing it. So that's how this book got started. It's a political and a cultural history of the United States' first real estate bonanza, this kind of mania for land speculation that sweeps the new republic. And I should note that people at the time did use that language of mania that's in the title of the book. Land mania is an 18th century phrase. People at the time called the land business a rage, a madness, a drug. And when I was starting to put the dissertation together, it occurred to me that that language was kind of useful evidence, that it indicated that people at the time saw the land business in the early republic as a national trend, as a coherent national event, and that they also saw its kind of crazy intensity and its unprecedented scale as something that was both sort of new to their place in time, but also kind of inexplicable. And that's why they reach for this language of mania, of sickness. The book takes that language as kind of the springboard for a set of questions, not as a sort of clinical diagnosis, but as the starting point to ask things like, why did this huge wave of land speculation sweep the new United States? Why did speculators buy so much land? Why did governments sell it to them in such huge quantities? And what does all of this have to say about the meaning of the American Revolution and the kind of character of the young United States?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking about mania as a word that we don't use today as a medical term, but it was in the 18th century, a medical diagnosis. So the land mania, the sickness, the sort of madness around it. I want to turn now to sources, the way that you go, this is sort of that was how you came into the project, starting with a research paper in graduate school and then building and building and building and not finding the answer to what you needed. So ultimately going out and writing the answer to the thing that you had been looking for, which is a great way to find a topic. I want to turn now to thinking about the sources that you use to do this. And I come to this in part because you wrote an article that I love. It's very short. It's in the Journal of the Early Republic, published in 2021, and it's called The Heart of the Deal, for those of you who don't already know it. And it was part of a forum of historians who were responding to David McCullough's book, The Pioneers. And in this piece, which is because it's so short and because it's really thinking about how historians engage with sources and with text, it teaches really well. I've used it in my undergraduate classes, and it works for those of you who are interested in such things. So you wrote there about 3 key strategies, and I'm going to read it for you here. You say the 3 key strategies, this is what it is. To avoid cherry-picking evidence that merely substantiates our preconceptions, we strive to account for everything we find in the historical record. To filter out bias and to sort perceptions from historical reality, we draw on different types of documents from multiple perspectives. And finally, this is the third point, to unlock the meaning of our sources and to see factors at play that they do not address, we interpret our evidence in historical context gleaned from up-to-date scholarship. So this was a reflection on how to think about sources, where you dove deeply into how he used one particular source around the Ohio Land Company. Um, and you said basically he hadn't done his research, and so the story he was telling was actually very small, and actually it was a much more interesting story if you dig in. You were writing this just as you're finishing up this book, as you were sort of probably getting your final drafts in. So could you talk to us a bit about how you did this, how you model this, how you approach sources in your own work?
Sure, I'd love to. So the first thing I'll say is that there were a lot of different kinds of sources that went into this book. Some of which I do read pretty traditionally, I'll confess. Newspapers, government documents like laws and treaties and land policies and legislative minutes. Another big chunk of sources that I spent a lot of time with at the library company in particular is sort of booster literature and promotional materials meant to kind of, puff pieces for the land business, basically. This stuff is pretty fantastical. It's over the top. If you read it together as a genre, and in doing so, kind of find your way towards filtering out some biases, separating truth from fiction, thinking about what people at the time would have found persuasive, then you can get kind of a good sense of the intellectual history of the land business, like what the ideas were that gave land such pull as an investment during this era. I also read a ton of land speculators' correspondence. Business correspondence, yeah, but I figured out pretty quickly that letters between fellow speculators, between like investment partners, or between speculators and government officials, tended to yield less juicy evidence than letters between siblings or letters between friends or like college roommates or husbands and wives. So a lot of my favorite quotations in the book come from letters between people who were kind of willing to momentarily let their guard down on the page. That's where I get a lot of the evidence for kind of how it felt to be so deeply invested in the land business. And then a massive chunk of the sources that went into this book are what we might call like land documents. Talking about, deeds and plats and contracts, warrants, stuff that's kind of like rendered in legalese. They're basically sources that record ownership of individual tracts of land or land transactions, or that are kind of the like, paper refuse of government processes for doling out land. And anybody who spends time in early American archives, whether you're a historian or an archivist or a genealogist, you're going to be in some sense pretty familiar with these kinds of sources, these kinds of documents related to land speculation. I mean, they're everywhere. It seems like every collection, every family collection in an archive has at least one land papers box. So they're everywhere. They can be pretty excruciatingly boring. I think if a lot of researchers are familiar with, encountering these kinds of documents, they're also probably familiar with the experience of trying to read them and finding them either inscrutable or just like downright dull. And in honesty, they often are, at least on the surface. And that's because a lot of these documents, things like land warrants and deeds, had work to do. They were trying to reify land claims that were, in fact, highly contested, or they were trying to make what was in truth an ongoing process of expansion and dispossession seem already complete. Or they were trying to kind of wrap risky investments, kind of high stakes land ventures, in a sort of a veneer of confidence and security and inevitability. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of these land documents try to make the land business seem boring. That's some of the work that they try to do. So my method, I guess, if you could call it that, was basically to not believe them at first, to know that every ostensibly boring or ephemeral land document really has a story behind it and a much broader significance. So a lot of the research for this book entailed trying to basically excavate the drama that lies beneath these land papers, using the strategies I talked about in the JER essay, um, to kind of show how these documents connect to broader histories of dispossession and finance and revolutionary state building. And I hope that that's one of the contributions that makes this book useful or potentially interesting to readers. So I thought I'd share an example, and here we'll have an image, which I think this example can also serve to try to offer a sketch of sort of the overall arc of the book. Let me see if I can get the screen sharing here figured out. Da-da-dum, da-dum, ta-da. How's that look? Awesome. Okay, so I want to talk about this piece of paper. This is it's a tattered little coupon. It's not much bigger than the palm of your hand. It's from the state archives in Kentucky, Frankfort, Kentucky. As you can see, it's meant to look kind of official, right? It's got this wax seal. It's got an intricate border meant to discourage counterfeiting. But as you can also see, it's pretty dingy. It's kind of ragged. It wasn't made to last 250 years. This is a military land bounty. And in the summer of 1783, when it was, a nice, fresh, crisp piece of paper, it was issued by the state of Virginia to a guy named Charles Robinson, who was at that point a 40-something-year-old private in the Continental Army. And Robinson had spent most of the war at Fort Pitt. He was part of a regiment that waged really vicious campaigns against Native communities aligned with the British during the war, and also worked pretty hard to kind of court allies for the Patriots among Native people in the Ohio country. In the course of these efforts, on behalf of the Patriot cause, Robinson was wounded. He took a gunshot somewhere near his right shoulder, maybe during an attack on Shawnee or Delaware villages. And this coupon, which he got at the end of the war, was meant to entitle him to a bit of payment, to a land bounty of 200 acres, which was going to be located somewhere in present-day Kentucky, which was then, at the time, and here's an essential bit of context that the source itself won't give you, the kind of thing I was getting at in that JER essay. At the time, present-day Kentucky was a crucial hunting ground for British allied Shawnees and Cherokees. So right off the bat, we have to acknowledge that, this was contested land that a patriot government planned to take from people it thought had lost the Revolutionary War and give to soldiers on the winning side. It looks official, but it's a source about a government trying to pay for a war kind of on a wing and a prayer with land that it doesn't yet control. Now, there's nothing particularly special about this coupon. There's like tens of thousands of others just like it. I chose this one pretty much at random. And in that sense, this land bounty, Robinson's land bounty, is kind of emblematic of where the arc of this book begins. I mean, it's pretty well known that patriots tried to use native land to pay for the Revolutionary War, right? To pay down war debt, to dole it out to soldiers, to sell for public revenue. What's less well known, I think, and what surprised me during the research for this book, is just how populist those early plans were. The goal was kind of twofold. It was, yeah, to use land expropriated from Native people to pay down war debts and fund new governments. But it was also to expand the class of propertied citizens, of independent property owners capable of the virtue and the vigilance that 18th century Americans thought was necessary to sustain a republic. And initially, it seemed like achieving those two goals, using expropriated land for fiscal purposes and also to create this kind of Republican citizenry, both of those goals actually required preventing land speculation, preventing speculators from engrossing frontier land at super low prices. So what I found was that during the first few years of independence, extending well into the 1780s in some states, every state that claimed large amounts of frontier land at first attempted to build a land policy that would discourage speculation and would instead kind of channel land in small farm-sized tracts straight to ordinary settlers. So Robinson's land warrant here is kind of an artifact of that populist plan, right? It's partial payment for wartime service to a revolutionary state that didn't have anything else to compensate him with except other people's land. But this plan to kind of dole out land directly to settlers, it had a couple of flaws, which are also reflected in this source. The first one was the land's location. So in this case, in the case of this land bounty, the land was 400 miles from where Charles Robinson actually lived. It was deep in the heart of Indian country. And this is, this is, again, another thing the source won't itself tell you. This is an era when native nations west of the Appalachians were tremendously strong, when they ruled their territories as independent sovereigns. So, this bounty entitles Robinson to move onto those lands that Cherokees and Shawnees had not willingly relinquished, but that's a dangerous proposition. He wasn't interested. The same was true for most districts where land bounties would apply. The second flaw with this kind of populist approach is that the Revolutionary War was followed by a really severe economic depression. Robinson, he didn't need land, he needed cash. And the same was true for a lot of other Continental veterans. So a lot of veterans just sold these land bounties kind of out of necessity, and they sold them for a pittance because, it wasn't clear that the weak revolutionary state of Virginia could ever kind of make good on the promise that this certificate embodied. So let me show you now the flip side of this land warrant, the reverse, where this part of the story unfolds. What happened is that Robinson, 2 months after he got this certificate, he signed it over like a check in exchange for goods or maybe to settle a debt to a guy named Francis Holland. Robinson was illiterate, so he signed it with his mark, this kind of jagged little 2. And over the next 15 years, this piece of paper changed hands again and again and again, at least like 5 or 6 more times. It was finally pooled with 8 other land bounties to yield one land speculator a tract of 1,300 acres somewhere near Bowling Green, Kentucky. And as sort of a material artifact, this certificate kind of, I think, shows evidence of all that exchange, right? That's why it's so worn and torn. That's why it tore into thirds and had to be taped back together by some archivist in Kentucky. Now multiply the story of this land bounty by tens of thousands, and you can kind of begin to get an idea of how the attempt to pay for the revolution by channeling land directly to ordinary citizens instead turned into this kind of speculative bonanza. Speculators purchased these things by the fistful on the open market, kind of stacking them up to redeem them to make huge land holdings, 3,000 acres here, 50 or 100,000 acres there, which they anticipated could soon be resold for really, insane profits. Two quick examples of this. There's one speculative venture that I did a lot of research for at the Historical Society next door. It's called the Pennsylvania Population Company. And they used land bounties like Charles Robinson's, but from the state of Pennsylvania, to amass something like 400,000 acres north of Pittsburgh. That's what this map depicts, the area shaded in red. Similarly, for a familiar Philadelphia name, William Bingham, this really prominent merchant, one of the country's wealthiest men, a library company shareholder. Bingham tried to use bounties like Charles Robinson's to buy as much land as he possibly could. At one point in the 1790s, he envisioned purchasing something like 4,000 or 4 million acres from Maine to Pennsylvania. So that's really the central drama of this book, is explaining how and why the New Republic went from that early populist plan for distributing expropriated land to people like Charles Robinson, to ordinary citizens. How the Republic went from that to this nationwide mania by the likes of William Bingham. The land bounty story is just kind of just one part of it, but hopefully this deep dive into a single source kind of gives you a taste of the arc of the book.
Thank you so much for that. Um, I love that land warrant, the sort of drama of seeing just the pre-printed, very, very little manuscript text on it with that dramatic reveal of the backside of it. Um, I, thank you. Uh, all right, so having done this sort of big methodological question about the kinds of sources that you use, I want to let you talk or ask you to talk a little bit more about who we're talking about. Like who's buying Robinson's land warrant? Who are these land speculators and how do they come to have, and in the end, actually, how did they become victims or subject to the mania, the illness, the sickness, the madness, and how in turn do they become agents who are infecting others with the excitement? So who are these people? Who are we talking about?
Yeah, this is a good question. They are, I mean, land speculators they're a pretty broad cross-section of the early Republican elite. They're, both the already wealthy and kind of aspiring folks, sort of men on the make. They're lawyers, they're merchants, they're planters, they're physicians, they're surveyors, they're military officers. They were in every state in the Union. They're in port cities. They're in, contested frontier zones. They're in native territory. Traditionally, I think historians have tended to see the stereotypical land speculator as a federalist. Um, but in fact, there's land speculators all across the political spectrum. And that kind of makes good sense when you think about it for a second, because yeah, land speculation was bound up with the kind of highfalutin finance that we tend to associate with the Federalists, with Hamilton, with port city merchants and lawyers. But it's also a business that tries to capitalize on the rustic agrarian ideal at the heart of Jeffersonian political economy. So, as an investment opportunity, land really appeals to the full political spectrum. Um, Land speculators were white. They were almost exclusively male, almost exclusively. But beyond that, I think the only thing that really kind of binds them together as a category, the thing that makes a land speculator, and by the way, that's a term that some of them proudly embraced and used as a self-identifier, was that they bought into a set of ideas about land and about the future, about the US future. Um, they bought into a really enthusiastic discourse about US population growth that was kind of all over the place in the early national era, all over the newspapers and treatises and pamphlets about this, which led people to think that the United States population was going to double like at least every 25 years, maybe every 20, maybe every 15, and that demand for land would therefore be potentially infinite. Um, they tended to see US conquest and native dispossession as basically inevitable, even though this is like a really, some real kind of cognitive dissonance that I think had to go on here, because the 1780s in particular was a point of US weakness on the Atlantic stage, on the North American stage. It's a decade of mounting native power. US expansion was not at all assured during the 1780s, but land speculators believed that it was. And they also all bought into the importance of land as kind of a political foundation for republicanism. They bought into the ideal of the yeoman farmer as the kind of prototypical citizen of a republic, whose economic independence would make them politically independent and therefore a good Republican citizen. And they believed that, with this kind of set of ideas combined, that there would A, always be a market for land, and B, that its value could only ever go up, that there would never be an occasion when land values could decline. So this all kind of coheres into a logic, I think, that it's fair to say every single land speculator believed. And that to me is what land mania meant. It to them it made sense, but and it drove them to sort of invest as deeply as they possibly could because it made land seem like a sure bet, like there was no downside to it. But to others who maybe don't share one of those set of ideas that unite land speculators together, it seems like irrational exuberance. It seems like mania. So, to give a sense of what this looked like, or maybe what it felt like a little bit, the experience of buying into the logic of land mania, I like to share the story of a house, this house in Connecticut. Okay, I'm going to bring up another image now. Da-da-da-dum. There we go. Okay, so this is a house in Connecticut, in Suffield, in northern Connecticut. It's open as a museum. I visited this house pretty early on in grad school, like shortly after I kind of landed on this dissertation topic, and dragged along my then girlfriend. And thankfully, it wasn't enough to make her break up with me. The house is a fascinating place. I couldn't stop thinking about it for, months on end afterwards. And now it's how I start chapter 3 in the book. I try to kind of read this house like a historical document. It's a big house. It's kind of ostentatious. It's unwieldy. I think it looks kind of awkward. It belonged to this kind of hot-headed former tavern keeper named Oliver Phelps uh, in the early national era. Phelps he had worked as a merchant during the Revolutionary War. He had sold provisions to the Continental Army. And then in 1788, he partnered with a Massachusetts politician to buy a government claim to 6 million acres of Iroquois or Haudenosaunee land, which is today much of New York State west of Syracuse, 6 million acres for $1 million. That scheme failed in the space of a couple of years, but in the meanwhile, he had started investing all over the place. He was buying land in Virginia and Kentucky, Vermont, Ohio, Georgia, I mean, all across the new republic. And he bought this house, or the part of it that was the original slice of the house, in 1788, the year he made that kind of first huge speculative purchase. And it was supposed to be, a pad to match his mounting prospects, to announce that he was a man on the rise. And upon moving in, he did a handful of things to the house. I'm not sure if it's possible to see on this image the kind of large blocks on the very left corner of it. Those are called coins, with a QU, coins. They're like wooden blocks resembling stonework. And he had them kind of smacked all around the corners of the house to try and make it seem a bit more hefty and substantial and solid. Uh, he opened in this kind of squat wing in the foreground, he opened a land office where he was going to sell tracts that he was buying and selling to fellow New Englanders. And then after a couple of years of this, in 1794, he doubled the house's size to the size it is today. Adds all this fancy stuff inside, intricate cabinetry, fine paneling. My favorite part is this amazing French wallpaper, which is pasted throughout the entirety of the new wing. Oftentimes people would put this kind of fancy stuff just in the public rooms, the parlor. No, this was in Phelps's bedroom. It was in the closets. It was all over the place. It's beautifully preserved. They're actually just starting a new conservation project on it now. And if you go there to see it, the patterns are like dizzying. And that's exactly the effect that Phelps wanted. Sort of dizzy visitors. So this house is like a real estate magnate's architectural statement. I think of it as kind of the Trump Tower of central Connecticut in a certain sense. But even as he's kind of placing this house on the cutting edge of refined taste, reflecting his success as a speculator, the renovations are also a little weird. They make the house feel kind of lopsided. The new wing sits further back from the road than the old wing. It didn't really fit with like the symmetrical conventions of its age. He did other weird things inside the house. He hung this portrait of himself in which he holds an envelope with his name on it. Because apparently, he wanted you to remember who he was, but he also thought that visitors to the house needed to be taught who he was. So this is kind of all a little bit gauche by the standards of 18th century gentility. And it kind of smacks of like 18th century new money. But even that phrase new money is a little bit off because really Phelps's entire speculative empire was built like entirely on credit. He had bought a lot of land, but by the time he's making these crazy renovations to this house, he had sold almost none of it. Um, and so it's all kind of premised on the assumption that his land investments are someday, very soon, going to translate into awesome wealth. My favorite part about all of this is that in the midst of all these speculations, which were in truth highly leveraged, deeply risky, Phelps gets reports from New Haven that his 16-year-old son, Lester, who was a student at Yale, had become he had developed a gambling problem. There's a letter written to him where it's reported from one of the tutors that his son has become one of the greatest gamblers in college. And Phelps kind of, Father Phelps sort of dutifully writes to chide his son, and he can do so with a straight face because he was so bound up in the ideas that suggested land was not a bet at all, that the land business was a sure thing, that it was the furthest thing from gambling. It's that kind of thinking that united and defined land speculators in the 18th century. Um, Unsurprisingly, Phelps's investments didn't pay out. He ends up having to mortgage the house. Eventually, he flees to escape creditors in Western New York. But the mansion kind of remains behind as this monument to the logic of land mania, to this kind of iron faith in future financial success that can be drawn from the land business.
As you're talking, I'm thinking we're talking about the Bitcoin bros of their era, right? The shared idea of a certain sort of set of truths that are going to fund a particular project. I have more questions for you. I've been writing down several as we go. However, we are already at 7:45, and so I want to open it up to the audience's questions. I believe there is a function where you can ask questions. I don't know if that has to be opened to you or if you all been holding off. Hang on. Yeah, so there we go. The Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you start populating questions in there, I'm sure we can ask Michael to address them. One that occurs to me that we haven't talked about yet, but unless someone else pops up with a question first, is about how all of this, you situate, okay, how your study makes us rethink the American Revolution, right? Like this is one of the most important developments happening alongside the growth of the new republic, both in terms of its aging, right? Its evolution over time, but also its expansion up in north into Maine and Vermont, but mainly west. So how do you see this work, your work, transforming the way that we should think about or teach the American Revolution? Like how does it help us understand the revolution in ways that we haven't otherwise?
Yeah, I'll say I think two things in response to this question. Try and offer two senses of how I think about the stakes of this project. One has to do with this kind of long-standing feud among historians of the American Revolution over what the meaning and the ultimate outcome of the revolution was. I think it's fair to say that for pretty much a century, if not longer, scholars have kind of been divided into two camps. On the one hand, there's like a group of historians who think that the revolution was fundamentally about extending political and economic opportunity, that it was a democratizing revolution. And on the other hand, you have a group of historians who say, no, what actually happened, if you really look at, the kind of social and political history of the period, the revolution, in fact, ends with the consolidation of individual power and wealth that, maybe it begins as a people's revolution, but it ends with kind of this revolt of the elites embodied in the US Constitution, and, Hamilton's financial plan and the, kind of opulence of the 1790s. In the book, I try to suggest that these two competing interpretations are actually different sides of a single coin. And that we can see that in the history of land speculation, and that
Mhm.
both interpretations are premised on native dispossession. Because at the end of the day, what land speculators were trying to do is really profit off revolution. They're trying to make the fulfillment of a yeoman's republic, the creation of a property democracy, into a business, into their windfall, their, path to power and riches. Um, so that's kind of, thing one. The second thing I'll say is that I think there's a lot of failures that mark the era of land mania. The book ends with this crash that brings these speculators to their knees and throws a lot of them into debtor's prison in the late 1790s. But even so, despite like all the bankruptcies and failures that come out of this really risky investment, I think the consequences of this period of land speculation are really lasting and really long-standing because even the failures, even the losers, contributed to converting millions of acres of native land into private commodities, a form of property that long outlasted their own individual schemes. And not only that, but they also, because of the scale of the land business, and because of the specific sort of methods they deployed as investors, as speculators, this period teaches Americans to think about land in different ways, to think about it not just as a place that you can visit and use and farm, but as a commodity, and oftentimes as a really abstract one, as a financial instrument. So for me, one of the consequences of the American Revolution through this era of land mania is that it kind of rewired the connection between finance and property or finance and real estate. And it fused the two. It fused property ownership, um, the American dream in some senses, to financial capitalism. And I think it's not hard to think in, the crazy real estate market of the early 2020s, how much that legacy kind of continues to play out in new chapters in our own day. For me, that story begins with the American Revolution and its fusion of finance and real estate.
Um, that is great. And it helps me think, you said at the beginning that you're thinking of your work as a political and cultural history. It's fascinating that you don't describe it as an economic history, which you also could and maybe should. It's certainly political economy. Um, but that the culture, the work of culture in part that I hear you describing here is the way that it is changing, shifting the idea of what land is and its relationship to the polity and to political culture, political possibility. So
Yeah,
empire, but
absolutely.
also individuals. All right, but there's some questions starting to stack up here. So I want to bring you the first from Belle Hickory, who's asking about how your research gets into the violence of the frontier. You know, that we know that there is terrible violence happening as Indigenous people are attacking white settlements, as white settlers are attacking Indigenous homelands. So I think what Belle is asking, she says, why did they persist anyway? And I think what she means here is why did in the face of that violence, why do people, white people, settlers, go voluntarily, and in some cases not voluntarily, into these spaces where they're going to be put in peril? Does your work get into that conflict, the role of that violence?
It does in part. And I mean, I think the simplest version of the answer I have to give is because they were quite literally invested in it.
Mhm.
Because the people at the heart of this land business had thrown their entire fortunes, every like, iota of capital they claimed and credit they could command into the future settlement of native lands and into native expulsion. This becomes vividly clear in some periods of the early 1790s when the federal government fights a war that doesn't particularly have a name. A
Right.
lot of historians call it the Northwest Indian War. That's an imperfect name for all kinds of reasons, but fights a longstanding war in the Ohio Company, or excuse me, in the Ohio Country, uh, for dispossession, largely on behalf of speculators who have been investing in the region for, for years by that point. Uh, one other thing I'll note is that land values do kind of they're super hard to track. This is one of the reasons why I don't call this book an economic history, because like,
Mm.
trying to figure out what a dollar is where and when in the early republic versus what a pound is where and when in the early republic is that in and of itself would take exactly as long as it took to write this book. But it is from the research I was able to do about tracking land values over time, it is clear that they can kind of follow the vicissitudes of war, of formal war, of kind of informal frontier violence, of violence between invading settlers and native people trying to defend their lands. And that when it's clear that some kind of threshold is going to be reached, like when a treaty council is called, in the case of the Northwest Indian War, to bring an end to the violence in 1794, 1795, land values spike. Um, and
Right.
that's kind of exactly what speculators are counting on. That for a lot of them, they kind of get in at the ground level when you can buy, land for 2 cents an acre, and then by the time peace is being brokered and this region is really ready to be opened, quote unquote, for white settlement, lo and behold, the federal government sets a benchmark price of $2 an acre. And so land speculators who've been kind of holding on to these claims to contested lands for several years are able to profit off the difference between those two things.
Right. And so you've got this huge economic cohort that is invested in war, is invested in that violence of being ongoing. And so whether or not some people on the frontier are being killed on either side is less important to the larger project of, that war ultimately lets them buy low and then sell high. That's what they're hoping anyway. All right, we have another question. Your thoughts about contemporary speculation post the Consolidation Act of 1854 in Philadelphia. Um, Sorry, this is from David Rhodes. What are your thoughts about contemporary speculation post-Consolidation Act of 1854 in Philadelphia? It seems that we're in a bit of a pattern post-Civil War, post-Depression, and so on. Right now, we are actually seeing this sort of speculation again. How do you think of your book as aiding contextualizing the present?
Well, I mean, I guess I have to confess that I'm a historian and I'm an early American historian, which for me ends around Andrew Jackson. So, I don't have anything particularly to say about the 1850s in Philadelphia, but I will say that I do hope I don't try to be a forecaster. I don't pretend to have like uncovered um, the rules of land bubbles. Uh, but I do hope that this book kind of enables people who find themselves kind of stuck when it comes to housing nowadays, to see their predicament in long historical context. I mean, I think anybody who is interested in buying a home but can't because of the way land values have spiraled upwards in the last few years, or whose rent keeps going up because so many rentals in this country are being bought up by hedge fund landlords, that they can kind of, you know, I don't think that this book will enable them to take heart, but maybe it can at least help them to situate their moment and their experiences in a longer historical arc, and to acknowledge that this is in some sense a legacy of the founding era, the link between property and financial capitalism in this country.
We are winding down on time, so I want to take two more questions and sort of sandwich them together for you.
Mhm.
Christine D asks about historical memory. To what extent do you think the historical memory of the speculators of the 1790s shape Americans' sense of region and place, and becoming useful political capital in ensuing decades? So sort of how political memory works. And then Claire McCabe, who is, by the way, a fantastic PhD student at Temple University, um, asks about female speculators. You mentioned that they're mainly men. So these questions don't necessarily drive together, but we're going to put two together because this is our last little moment. How do you think about political memory, like the political memory of these speculations, and where are the where are the women? We know Abigail Adams is buying up. She's speculating in currency. So what's happening in land?
These are great questions. The quickest possible answer to Christine D's question is that this historical memory is everywhere because the speculators, wind up oftentimes being the local notables in places that become settled. They smack their name on everything. The region where I grew up in Western New York, part of the lands that Oliver Phelps was involved in buying and selling the the entire region is named after him and towns, counties named after him, his partners, and the various kind of smaller scale land speculators that he ended up selling to. So there's a little bit of this is the result of a really nasty process of dispossession and expropriation, but it ends up getting kind of laundered to the point that now these people's names are absolutely everywhere. One person whose name is not anywhere is the one female land speculator I found. Jess is absolutely right that that women who managed property or capital were much more interested in speculating in bonds or in currency. It seemed to them like easier to do, a little bit less risk involved. Land speculation, it both appeals to kind of, patrician sensibilities, and it has this kind of like masculine edge to it. A lot of land speculators call themselves adventurers, even if they're just kind of hanging out in their armchair. So I looked hard. I found one female land speculator, and she was actually a refugee from the French Revolution. Her name is Rosalie Joseph Baclay de Laval, and she got involved in mainland speculation in the 1790s. It's a pretty fascinating story. She ends up having to sell sell the lands back because citizenship issues kind of get in the way of all of it, and she ends up like marrying the Dutch minister to the United States, and they run away to Dutch Guiana. You won't find a township called De Laval in Maine nowadays.
No, but maybe we should have a Broadway musical about her immediately.
So I'd go see it.
I mean, okay. All right. Well, we are right at 8 o'clock. Thank you so much, Michael, for this fantastic conversation and for this contribution that you've brought to the scholarship. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, it's a wonderful book. And I can't recommend it highly enough. So go out to your library, or even better yet, your local bookseller, and pick up a copy. And join me in thanking Michael for this wonderful evening, this fireside chat. This is a COVID hangover. We started doing these as a COVID thing. So there's no fire and there's no side, but we are all together and getting to have these wonderful conversations that project out nationally or internationally. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hosting the rest of you back to future events at the Library Company. And once again, thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Justin. Thanks to you all for tuning in.
Yay! Bye.